Hello, folks, and welcome back to World War II TV and the second part of our Codes and Code Breaking Week. And I hope you all saw David Alexander's brilliant introduction to the whole principle behind codes and why they're important, the different types of codes yesterday. And today we're going to a slightly deeper dive, and we're looking at the role of Bletchley Park in the preparation for and the execution of D-Day. And as you know, I always try and bring the very best guest I can for each subject, and I have brought the very best guest for this subject. Dr. David Kenyon is the author of this fine book, Bletchley Park and D-Day, which I have 2 copies of. Don't ask me why. The link to purchase the book, as usual, is in the description below. I urge you to go out and get that so you understand at greater depth what we're covering tonight. But that remains for later, the detail of the book. But right now, I'm introduce my guest, Dr. David Kenyon. So good evening, David. How are you today?
Good evening, Paul. I'm very well indeed, thank you.
So as I said there in the top of the show there, we did the basics to codes yesterday, and now we're going to go and look at the role of Bletchley Park with regards to D-Day. But in your case, when did your interest in the code breaking aspect of World War II begin? Was it a small boy? Was it puzzles? Was it reading about it? Give us an idea where it all began for you.
Well, I get asked this quite often, and I got the job here at Bletchley slightly by accident, but my earliest involvement with codes was those of us over about 50 probably remember Warlord comic.
Oh, yes.
And in Warlord, you could become a Warlord secret agent and support Lord Peter Flint. And in the very early days, there was a coupon you could cut out of the magazine, out of the comic, which had a very simple substitution cipher on it. And your task was to break the sentence of the substitution cipher and send it in with your 25p postal order. And then you got sent a little wallet with a code book in it. And
I remember it completely. I've still got my wallet somewhere in a box downstairs.
So yes, we're a select and greying band, Warlord secret agents. But yeah, so that was my first sort of brush with this kind of thing, and I've been, as the fact that I was a Warlord reader at the age of 7 or whatever indicates, that I've been a military historian and a World War II enthusiast since I could read a book, more or less. And I've been lucky to make it my job over the years in different ways, through like yourself, doing a bit of guiding, through media work, through publications, and through archaeology. I was an archaeologist for many years, mainly working on First World War sites. Actually, I dug up a lot of trenches in my time. But then in 2015, I was lucky enough to, they created the post of historian at Bletchley Park, and they gave it to me. So
well, and we're pleased to have you. And
yeah, so
before we get into your presentation, the fascinating thing is that when we talked about the Battle of Britain, for example, a few weeks ago, the Battle of Britain was being written about and talked about in the general public while it was happening, and books were being produced during the war, and then just cascades of books and films came out. The code breaking at Bletchley Park was something that people who were there knew a little bit about what they were doing in their particular hut or room or building, but the general public didn't know anything about it for decades. So in a sense, the world is still playing kind of catch up in the understanding of the codes and the use of codes and what information can be gleaned from them. Whereas, as I said, something like the Battle of Britain, we've got nearly 8 decades of study there. So I was talking to you before going live. You're still developing exhibits at Bletchley Park. There's still work to be done. There's still archives to be perused, which must make it a fascinating aspect of history to be involved with.
Very much so. I touch on this a little bit in my presentation, but it is striking that the story was completely secret until the mid-1970s, and even then the flow of hard information was quite slow, and it's, you know, stuff has been declassified certainly in the 2000s and as late as 2018. So there's definitely still work to do on the story. And it always strikes me as odd in a way that some of the films we grew up watching as kids, things like The Man Who Never Was, about Operation Mincemeat, and I Was Monty's Double, and all these, there's a lot of intelligence stories that broke very shortly after the war, but the most important one of all, if you like, remained completely secret.
And there's all sorts of reasons behind that, not least of which the Cold War and all sorts of other things.
Absolutely,
as well,
yes. If you're a government who knows about these things, the last thing you want to do is share it with anybody. So
Exactly. Anyway, without further ado, as usual, Mike, you've come armed with a PowerPoint, and we will hand over to you. And folks, we will do the majority of the questions at the end of the talk tonight. I think that's how we'll do it. But if there's anything along the way that you want to say or ask, we'll address it as we go along, just to keep a bit of interactivity going. But essentially, I'm going to hand over to my guest now, Dr. David Kenyon, and we are going to talk about the role of Bletchley Park connected to D-Day. So over to you, David.
Thank you. Well, the first thing I need to sort of cover, I suppose, is when you set out to write a book about something, the question everyone asks is, why do we need another book on this subject? And so I thought it was worth picking up, like you were saying, about the secrecy of the story, just what's been written about it in the past. And here's 3 books that I commend to everybody, but they're all flawed in the different ways, if you like. The one in the middle is The Official History, of course, that came out in 1962. I'm not enough of a D-Day historian to say how much of it is out of date now, but it's certainly a great book. But of course, it contains no information about SIGINT at all, because the whole thing was still secret at that point. So Ultra doesn't get a mention in that book. The first book that really brought it to public attention was the one on the right, Ultra in the West, by Ralph Bennett. He was a historian. Well, he worked at Bletchley Park in Hut 3, so he was right at the heart of the game at the time. And when the first tranche of declassifications happened in the 1970s, he went and read all the messages that were sent to commanders in the field. And there's something like 45,000 of them. So bless him for doing it, because it meant I didn't have to. And he wrote an excellent book where he basically took the message traffic and compared it with the historical events and said, you know, how well do these match? And it's a very interesting read, but unfortunately, he didn't have access to all the information that's now available. And so it has become a bit out of date. The one on the left, British Intelligence in the Second World War, is the official history and was written with access to huge amounts of information by another chap who was also a Bletchley veteran, Harry Hinsley, who worked in Naval Section. And again, it's 4 volumes long. It's many thousands of pages, so it's a pretty dense read. So, you know, and also he wasn't really interested in the process. He was only interested in the outcome. So he doesn't really talk about the mechanics of how this stuff was achieved. So I felt there was a real window here to tie it all together.
And I have to say, having read your book, it's distinctly more readable, particularly British Intelligence in the Second World War. I think I've got 2 of the 4 volumes. It's hard going. There's lots of good information, but oh god, it's a painful read.
It has great footnotes, but you don't want to read it all in one go. But yeah, I feel like, you know, it's the whole thing of standing on the shoulders of giants. You know, because this stuff existed, it gave me the opportunity to move forward with it. And the other thing I wanted to do is talking about Bletchley. There are so many books about Bletchley Park that are about code breaking specifically. They're about the ins and outs of how an Enigma machine works, and you know how a Zagowski sheet works or whatever it is. But very few books that say why we should care. You know, the number of books out there that say what is the intelligence impact of this stuff is quite small. You know, there's some great books about Naval Enigma, for example, and it's all about how do you break Naval Enigma. It's not about did it make any difference to the Battle of the Atlantic. So D-Day is a really good opportunity, because by 1944, Bletchley Park has become this kind of, it's at its prime. It's doing it what it does most effectively, if you like, in 44, 45. And if you look at what it did for D-Day, that's a great sort of frame to look at what it did altogether. You know, because so many of the aspects of its work are involved.
Of the benefits, and
it makes a perfect case study in that way.
David, about, because you mentioned the Ultra messages, is where, from Tim Sampson, is where they are kept, all the messages.
Well, this is rather the wonderful thing. They are all in the National Archives in Kew. You've moved on to the slide splendidly for me there. What's even better is they are all digitized, and you can read them for free online. So if you go to the National Archives website and you look at the series DEFI 3, all of the majority, nearly all of the messages that Bletchley produced for commanders in the field or for the War Office or wherever, or the Navy, are in there. But they are in blocks of 1,000 in PDFs. So again, you have to kind of know what you're looking for. You have to know which date you need, and of course they're in order of decryption. They're not in order of transmission. And because the period it takes to break the messages varies, sometimes a message isn't on the day that you expect it to be. It might be a week later. So they are all there, but they're not the most accessible source. The wonderful thing about Ralph Bennett's book was he read all 45,000 and he provides footnotes. So if you get his book out and you want to know about, 352 division in Normandy that I might talk about later, perhaps, you can look up 352 in the index and he will give you the message references for all of the messages or the key messages that related to that unit. So
in a sense, and pardon the pun, he gave us the key to break the code of
he
the
did, yes,
archives,
very much so. And Hinsley does the same quite often. There's good footnotes in Hinsley which allow you to track into the original material and find the messages concerned. But one of the things I'm going to talk about is the idea that those Ultra is really the tip of the iceberg. People think about Bletchley as kind of a news agency. They take in messages, they break them, and they pass them on to commanders. And that's, for a lot of people, they think that's the be-all and end of it. What I want to emphasize tonight is that what the Bletchley does is much more, much deeper than that and much more complicated. So what I thought I'd do is give you a sort of the 5-minute history of Bletchley Park. This map shows the site in 1939, effectively. So you have an organisation, the Government Code and Cipher School, that's actually existed since the end of World War One. It was set up in 1919, and it functioned quite happily in London for 20 years. But of course, in 1939, there is this perception that London's going to get bombed, and they need a place in the country to retreat to. So Bletchley Park is acquired. But at that point, there's only 150 people in the Government Code and Cipher School, and it's quite a small organisation. But it starts to grow on day one. I mean, on the 4th of September, another 100 people turn up. By the time you get to D-Day, there are 7,000 people working for GC&CS. So it is massively expanded. There's 9,000 by the end of the war, just in the immediate GC&CS code-breaking operation, not including all the people in the Y stations doing the intercept and the overseas stations, all the rest of it. So it's gone from quite a tiny bespoke organization into this vast, we refer to it as an intelligence factory, and that's a good way to think about it. Because once the famous characters, the likes of Turing and Tiltman and people, have figured out how these codes can be broken, what you then need to do is industrialize that process so that you can use those techniques to break many, many messages a day. Because the fundamental thing about Enigma is each message is a bit like a tweet. It's limited to 250 characters. So if you read one message, you're going to learn relatively little. But if by 1944 you're reading 3,250 character messages every day, suddenly you've got a hell of a lot of jigsaw puzzle pieces, and you can fit the thing together and you get a much, much deeper picture. And it's that industrial quantity of code breaking that makes the work of the site really important.
If I may say, that's one of the things that the movies and the documentaries have kind of implied. There's like one message coming through a day and 3 or 4 people are breaking it, and then one person kind of runs off with a briefcase to get on the telephone to Churchill. And as you're explaining, it's a factory. It's an entire. It's the size of an infantry division, effectively, involved in this process. And the scale of it, I think, gets a little bit lost, unless, of course, you've been lucky enough to visit Bletchley Park and see how much information there is there presented as a museum. You get some idea of how enormous the operation was. And we'll talk maybe at the end of the show about some of the myths that have kind of risen since the popularity of the subject came out with things like movies. But yeah, it is a factory of intelligence. And I think that's David O'Keefe used that phrase a couple of minutes in the sidebar before you said it. So it's obviously something that people in the know refer to it as.
Very much so. And it's that, I use this in my tours to intimidate school children. As you say to somebody, if I read one of your text messages, would I learn a lot about you? And they kind of look smug and go, no, that would be fine. And I say, what about if I read all your text messages for the last month? And that's when they start to look a bit nervous, because it's that pattern of life. It's the idea that if you gather enough of this stuff, even though each piece is not independently, there is no, what people always say to me, is the one really important Enigma message that was sent? No, there isn't. There's 10,000 really important Enigma messages that were sent, but they only have value if you read them by the 1,000. So the other myth, if you like, if we move to the next slide, is looking at Bletchley in 1944. Most people have this vision of people in tank tops with pipes in drafty wooden huts. By 1944, most of the huts are not in use for code breaking. The major intelligence activities are moved into these rather unsalubrious concrete blocks that were built. And so this block, Block D, that you can see in the picture there, was really at the heart of the D-Day operation. And actually, the inhabitants of Hut 3, Hut 6, and Hut 8 have all moved in there. And they're the three huts that are really dealing with the Enigma issue. And they're all inserted into Block D. What's interesting is when the site was first opened to the public back in the day, and veterans would come in and they'd say, "Oh, where did you work?" And they'd say, "Oh, I worked in Hut 3." And they take them into the timber Hut 3 and they go, "Oh, I don't remember this." This is because the organization that was in Hut 3 carried on calling itself Hut 3 when it had moved out and moved into Block D. And then Hut 3 was given a new number. So Hut 6 becomes Hut 16, Hut 8 becomes Hut 18, and Hut 3 becomes Hut 23 because they didn't want a Hut 13. But it's again, it's emphasizing this sort of industrial character that there's lots and lots of people in this highly organized machine doing the work. And also, it's not just about Enigma. People think of Bletchley, they obviously think of Enigma, but there are multiple systems being used by multiple Axis powers that are involved. And it's the fact, not only are they collecting thousands of messages, but they're collecting them from different systems that provide different sorts of intelligence. And this diagram is a simplified diagram. It looks complicated, but what this shows is Hut 3 being kind of the spider at the center of the web. And I'll talk a little bit more about Hut 3 as we go forward. But you can see on this slide, there are a variety of sources of information coming in. There's the Enigma, as we've talked about, the Y station's intercepted, it goes into Hut 6, ultimately Hut 6 do the code breaking, and then they pass the raw decrypt into Hut 3. And Hut 3 is really the intelligence center. This is the bit where the translation is done, and then they put the picture together, and then they decide what information needs to be shared. And you can see there we have an arrow going downwards, which is Ultra, which is the material sent directly to field commanders. So once they're on the ground, that would be Montgomery and Patton and Dempsey and people in France, or prior to that, it's Schaeff. But you also have material going by bag to London. You also have sort of reports of various kinds being produced. So only about probably less than 10% of the intercepted material ends up as Ultra in that closely defined form of the material that's sent to field commanders. So if you want to understand the power of Bletchley, you need to look behind that and look at the much bigger information picture that they're creating. So, and the other thing that they're doing is,
the information's coming from the Japanese, I think, gets forgotten as well. I think
that's one of the counterintuitive bits that I will pick up as we go through. And the other important thing that Bletchley is doing is they're not just translating this information, decrypting this information, translating it and passing it on. They're storing it. They have indexes, and these are quite basic in form. It's the old-fashioned 6x4-inch index cards, but all of the intelligence they gather from every Enigma message is being captured on these cards and indexed. And what it gives them is this build depth of knowledge, so that, you know, if they see a message with a German officer's name in it, they can go and look him up and see which messages his name has appeared in for the last year and a half. And it's when you do that, when you have this sort of database of information, this is when it all becomes really, really powerful. And the other myth about Bletchley is that they did this in a vacuum. And some veterans have even said this, that somehow they tried not to worry about what was happening in the war because they wanted to just not have their thinking clouded by, you know, external things. This is not true at all. Actually, they were absorbing intelligence from other agencies and other sources all the time, because the more you know about the context of the traffic you're looking at, the easier it is to understand it. So they're pulling in stuff from air reconnaissance. They're pulling in stuff from SIS and SOE in France. They're pulling in stuff from POW interrogation. There's the whole raft of anything intelligence-y that they can get their hands on. They get it, and they use it to inform the picture they're creating.
Well,
so,
are we ready to move on?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, just in terms of those sources that we're talking about, I think you had both these machines described rather splendidly last night. I mean, you have an Army Enigma there on the left. A huge proportion of the material that's coming in is from Enigma. That, as you were hearing last night, in fact, you have this layering of code systems that your company signaler might be using ciphers sometimes, but he's going to be using pretty basic pencil and paper things that can, will take an hour to break, but that hour is long enough. And then as you go up the tree, the systems become more complex. Enigma is mostly used by the military, by the army and the SS at sort of divisional level. So you can imagine a divisional wireless unit will have Enigma, and they'll be communicating with other people at divisional and corps level. So it's quite a high level system in that sense. And then the Navy use it on every ship, but in the Army it's sort of divisional. And then if you go above that, once you get to Army Group and sort of headquarters, Hitler's headquarters, you're up to Lorenz, which is the teleprinter cipher you can see on the right there. And that's, although it has rotors, it works on quite a different system from Enigma. But it has the advantage that Enigma, the messages are limited to 250 characters, partly to protect the keys, but partly also because sending messages on it is very laborious. You've got to encrypt each letter one at a time by pressing the key and holding it down till the light comes on and writing down the answer. And then, so it's a bit of a faff. Lorenz has the advantage that you can type on a keypad and it enciphers it automatically and sends it down the line, and the machine at the other end deciphers it. So it's a much more, like I said earlier, if you want to send a tweet, you use an Enigma. If you want to send an essay, you need to use a Lorenz. Because you could, or a long email, for example, you want to use a Lorenz because it's just a more efficient system to use. If we look at the next slide, you can see here, Lorenz worked point to point. So these radio signals were intended to be directional, and each fish link, as it's called, works between one headquarters and another one. Actually, the signal isn't completely directional, so it could be intercepted in the UK, and they pick this stuff up in Knockholt down in Kent. But you can see on the map there all of the different individual connections between the German High Command institutions were given fishy code names by Bletchley. And because there were 52 of them by the end of the war, they get some pretty obscure fish by the end. But the ones I've ringed there are the ones that are really important for D-Day. If you look, you've got that square in the middle is Berlin, and then you've got one going off to the left, which is Jellyfish, I believe. Yep. It's quite small on my screen, yeah. And that's going to von Rundstedt to High Command West in Paris. So that's the link to Rundstedt, which is really important if you want to know what's happening in France and the Low Countries. You also have Bream, which is head south down to Kesslering in Italy. And that's an important link because particularly in the spring of 44, there are units moving back and forth between Italy and France. And indeed, Rommel has come from Italy to France in early 44 as well, I can't remember, late 43. But you also have all these links out in the east, stretching out to the various army groups on the Eastern Front. And one of the important things about understanding the intelligence picture for Normandy is you kind of have to understand the intelligence picture for the whole of Europe, because the Germans have no strategic reserve. There's no German divisions sitting in Germany training. Everybody's either in Russia or Greece or Italy or France. So if you can understand the order of battle on the Eastern Front, then you understand the order of battle in France, because a division that's in Russia can't be in France and vice versa. And actually, because prior to D-Day, there's no fighting in France, France is kind of used as a rest area or a training area for units from the East. So, and because you have at Meilly-le-Camp, you have the big Panzer training school. For example, when Panzer divisions are moving up to Neuwied, when they start training on Panthers and things like that, they will quite often come from the East to Meilly-le-Camp, will train for weeks or months, and then we'll go back to Russia again. So monitoring where those units are all around Europe helps to fill in your map of France. So understanding the whole fish network is really important. They actually read a tiny proportion of it. It's less than 5% of the traffic is less than 5% of the traffic that's intercepted is actually decrypted, and that's even what's intercepted is a tiny fraction of what's transmitted.
Wow.
So it's relative to what's out there. It's a very small proportion, but it's nonetheless a huge amount of material. By the end of the war, they'd successfully read 63 million characters of fish traffic. So if you think about that, that's 20 copies of the Bible. So it's quite a lot of intelligence.
Wow.
Particularly as it's only in use for the last sort of 3 years of the war. Moving on, we have low-level stuff, as was talked about last night. There are all these hand ciphers being used by lower-level organizations. The slide here is actually an Alka cipher, which is used by German aircraft in flight. And it's a 3-digit system where basically the 3 digits represented a word or phrase, and they were sometimes super enciphered with another system. But they changed the system sometimes daily. So Bletchley Park produced these pro forma sheets you can see here that have all the numbers from 0 to 999 on, and as they worked out what each word meant, they would write it on. But this sort of work is being done, and it fills in the gaps around the Enigma material and the other types of bits and pieces. The final one to move on, of course, we were talking about it earlier, is the Japanese. And it always sounds a bit counterintuitive to people when you say that Japanese intelligence is important for Normandy. But actually, this chap on the left, General Oshima, is really important because he's the Japanese ambassador in Berlin. And from 1940 onwards, his messages back to Tokyo are being read in the US and in the UK. He's using a machine system called Purple, which is the one, well, the Americans call it Purple, which is the one you see on the right there. And his messages were supremely important. And not only him, but there's a system called JMA, Japanese Military Attaché, that is broken at Bletchley by John Tiltman. And both Oshima and his attachés are taken on tours of the Atlantic Wall. And rather wonderfully, the Japanese military attaché in October 43, I think, writes a 30-page description of the Atlantic Wall that he then encrypts in JMA and sends back to Tokyo. So Bletchley gets a verbatim account of all of the German defenses. And it is on the level of, there are this many 50mm guns, there are this many 20mm guns, there's a minefield on the beach, blah, blah, blah. So it's really detailed stuff. And the other thing that they get from the Japanese, which is important, is because he's meeting Hitler regularly, you get almost from the horse's mouth, you get high command thinking on the German side. You get Hitler's expectations about the invasion, where he thinks it's going to be, and aspects like that. So Japanese stuff really important. If we go to the next slide, I'll just give you an example of this. This is one of the index cards recording the contents of Japanese messages that have been decrypted. And you can see there, it's the card for the German army, and there's all of the different messages. We have thousands of these cards, and you can see messages referring to when the invasion might happen, where it's likely, where the Germans think it's likely to be. And this same index has a card for Rommel, for example, where every time the Japanese ambassador mentions what Rommel might be up to, you're able to find it out, and it goes into the index. So when you pull all these sources together, all these different, both the German systems and the low-level systems and the Japanese material and your agent information and your air photography and everything else, you've got an enormously rich intelligence source that covers all of the different aspects of the problem, if you like.
But at this point, David, it's only surely as good as the humans who are interpreting it. It's all very well having index cards with information on it. It's all very well having this information, but you've got to have some people who know enough about the war generally to be able to kind of oversee the piece of this information together. But at the same time, if there are 7,000 people there in 1945, you can't have them all knowing about everything, because then secrecy gets out. So how on earth was it managed in terms of who was allowed access to what and who could see the bigger picture?
Well, this is the problem, in a way, that actually most of the staff who are involved in the decryption process know relatively little about what they're doing. and the processes are chunked up into a lot of tasks which would have been very, very boring to do and reveal relatively little about what's actually going on. We have veterans who describe people coming in and saying, well, they get a pile of pieces of paper with numbers on, and they go, well, sort these numbers into this particular order and then put them in this tray here. And they would do that, and someone would come in and go, thank you very much, well done, here's some more. So most people, it's very much, need to know. But the key comes in hut 3. Why I described it earlier as the spider at the center of the web is hut 3. All of this, or a huge proportion of this material, is flowing into that hut, and in that hut you have the specialists who are making sense of it all. And you have 2 groups. You have the watch, who are in sort of overall charge, but you also have dedicated teams. There's guys there who just do the railway. There's guys there who just do men and women. There's people there who just do the SS traffic, for example. And what they're doing is looking at this material, not just what's come in today, but what's been coming in for the last, year. And to jump ahead a bit, where are we? If you look at the next slide, one of the things, here we go. One of the things that happens in November 1942 is Bletchley Park, GC&CS is aware that an invasion is going to happen eventually. Nobody knows where, nobody knows when exactly, but it's pretty much it's going to be in France. And so as early as November 1942, some of the senior people at Bletchley Park, a chap called Professor Bose, who's head of air section, Oscar Ursa, who's head of who's in Hut 3. They have a thing called the Western Front Committee, and basically every Saturday morning they have a meeting and they have representatives from all the different branches. And what happens is they come in on a Saturday morning and say, right, what have you learnt this week about the German forces in France and the Low Countries? And they have a dedicated room where they have filing cabinets and wall maps and everything else, and they just start to build the picture of the German army in France, effectively. And it takes them a year and a half to do it. They start in November 42 and they work right through until 5th of June 44. But also that picture is evolving, because in 42 there are a lot fewer German divisions in France, and as the German forces augment, they start to pick up that growth, and they're also getting more and more detail, and they publish orders of battle and plot maps and things. By 1944, it's monthly. They're producing these updates which give you really granular detail about what the German military looks like, and its function is very, very useful for planning, but it also has a political dimension, because Roosevelt and Churchill are arguing about when the invasion should happen, indeed whether it should happen at all, because the question you have to ask is it going to succeed? And the only way you can do that calculation is to know what you're up against. And so this intelligence is going right to the highest level, saying, we anticipate that if you land on the beach on day 1, you will probably be confronting this many German divisions. After 2 days, they'll probably have this many. After a week, they'll have this many. And do you have enough forces to deal with that? And so it goes beyond the tactical and strategic planning. It goes right up to the is it doable at all kind of level. And if we go to the next slide, I can show you an example of this. Is one of the orders of battle that was produced. This is the 2nd of June, so this is one of the later, almost the last orders of battle that's produced. And you can see there we have, maybe zoom in a little bit, you have on the right, you have the various divisions, but then across the top you have the different kinds of battalions within the division. And then at the end you have where the headquarters are, and all of this information was captured. So you can see where they are, who their commanders were, what their component units were. And they're also pulling out information. In some cases, they have, for the Panzer divisions, they have information derived from fish traffic from Lorenz, where they've got tank states. They know how many vehicles there are in the units. They know how many men are present, how many are missing. And it becomes apparent, for example, with the SS Panzer units, that they are really, really short of NCOs. They've got plenty of junior soldiers, but they're the cadres of people that you really need to fight the battle, NCOs and junior leaders, they're really, really short of. And in many cases, they're very, very short of armor. There's a lot of these units that, if you look at the detailed orders of battle, you can see that they've got very few tanks. The one thing that seems to be in plentiful supply is assault guns, is Stugs. Everyone's got Stugs, but if no one's got Panthers, you know. So, and that granular information is really, really important. Interestingly, when Guderian gets appointed as Inspector General of Panzer Troops, he goes to France in March and April of 1944, and one of the things they pick up from Fish is his tour of inspection is circulated, and there's a message sent which says he will visit this division in this location on this day, and then the following day he'll visit this division on this location on this day. And so it gives you basically a complete catalogue of where all the major armoured units are.
Wow.
And so,
but of course, David, just to interrupt for a second, we're not relying solely on this information, because this is being augmented by aerial photos, information that's coming directly from Normandy and France and the SOE and resistance and things like that. It's, as you said, there, the interrogation of German prisoners that have been taken perhaps in Italy or Sicily are giving information. So, because it's a lot to put all your eggs in one basket, because there is theoretically the possibility that some of the information we're picking up is fake, or it's out of date, or it's designed to mislead or something. So it is only part of of the Allied arsenal for planning, isn't it?
But yes, it is. But one of the things that Bletchley are able to do is they have access to the other agencies. So there's another thing that's available in the National Archives are these things called the Martian reports. Have you come across Martian reports?
No.
MI14, which is the bit of military intelligence who are responsible for German order of battle, they produce weekly appreciations that are called Martian reports. And these are very heavily based on air photography and agent reports, so feeds from SAS and SOE. And they're full of, they have scale diagrams of German pillboxes, they have plots of minefields, the amount of stuff that's being obtained is absolutely fantastic. And these were shared with Bletchley, and of course they could then match them against their own information. And the way this works, there's a great example of when 12th SS Hitlerjugend is forming it starts its life in southern Belgium. And they get SIG that suggests that a new SS headquarters has appeared and is sending wireless messages. And they go, right, we've probably got an SS formation up there. What's going on? And at the same time, the Belgian resistance is sending the message going, the bars of the town are suddenly full of teenage SS men. And somebody else in the resistance is writing down vehicle number plates and sharing that information. And it's a process that is absolutely standard in modern intelligence, which they refer to as fusion, which is the idea that you get these multi-source intelligence and you fit them all pieces together, and they support one another. And what I was saying earlier, there was this perception that somehow Bletchley sat apart from all that and just did its code breaking thing and didn't talk to anybody. Actually, it's really engrossed in that process, and it's receiving feeds from all these other agencies that allows it to step beyond just being cryptographers and actually being an intelligence agency, a sort of fully fledged intelligence source in its own right.
And is it fair to say that's the kind of thing that has been a little bit lost in the fascination with Turing and the code breaking, that aspect is now well known, but it's the bigger picture is perhaps less understood, unless of course you've been to the museum. But
yeah, and it's a thing that doesn't happen overnight, because the perception in 1939 by the War Office, the Admiralty, the Air Ministry is that the code breakers are just there to do cryptanalysis, and that the intelligence rests in the government departments or in the services. But it becomes apparent as time goes on that the best people to understand the messages are the people that are breaking them, and that rather than giving the message to the guy in military intelligence to read it and compare it with the other material he's got, give the other material to the guy that's breaking the message in the first place, and he will give you a really get to the heart of the matter. And it takes a lot of negotiation and a lot of back and forth to develop that. And this is one of the issues that people forget about intelligence, is your customers, the people you're selling it to, have to know, they have to trust that it's right. They have to believe you when you tell them. And that is contrary to all the principles of security. For a long time, Bletchley Park is producing intelligence that they can't tell people where they get it from. They say they have to go to military commanders and say, we're not telling you how we get this, but believe us when we tell you it. And that balance of security versus trust and believability is a really fine line to walk. There's a brilliant bit in the history of Hut 3 where they say that their liaison officers used to go to the War Office every week, whether they had anything to tell them or not, just to kind of go and hang out with the guys there and have a cup of tea and build those personal relationships that meant when they came with some information that was important, the people that they had to tell it to would trust them and believe them. There's a lovely line where it says, we were able to convince the War Office that this material was produced by humans. It has a sort of, and so that relationship building thing is very important. This order of battle map gives you a sense of really just how good at this they were. By 6th of June 44, there are 57 divisions, German divisions in France and the Low Countries. Bletchley Park has identified all 57. They have the orders of battle for them all. They have their communications networks. They know their hierarchies. They know which corps they're in. There are one or two little bits, particularly with the parachute troops in Brittany, that are a little bit hazy. But essentially, they've got the whole picture, and that's taken them. It's taken them since November 42 to get there, but by keeping going for a year and a half, they've figured it all out. And what that gives the Allied planners and everybody else is just a massive information advantage. They know what they're up against, and.
We've just got a question here, David, about whether or not we shared information with the Soviet Union. I mean, there's two answers that I know in that there's willingly and unwillingly, I guess. But
yes, I mean the Cairncross famously is the only spy we know about who was working from within the Bletchley organization, and he was there in 42 and 43, and he does share material with the Russians. During that period, or with his handlers during that period, he literally smuggles it out down his trousers. But and information about the German planning for Kursk is shared by him. But actually, Churchill is trying to share the same material with the Soviets anyway at an official level. There's an interesting question about whether Stalin believed either of them. But and by 43, the Soviets' own intelligence on German intentions is really, really good. It's a complete side alley, but there's a question which I will probably never know the answer to, that academics speculate about, is whether the Soviets ever broke Enigma as well. We don't know that they did, but would they have told us?
That's a good point. And by the way, folks, I'm thinking about doing a show at some point in the future about Kursk and code breaking and ultra, because it's subject that different historians have different opinions on it. So we will go down that rabbit hole at some point in the future, because if everything happened that we think happened, the battle was absolutely influenced by code breaking. But then there are other people saying it was going to go the way it went anyway. But we'll go down that rabbit hole in due course when it comes up.
Yeah, there's a very interesting article where the guy American historian talks about the idea that the Soviets certainly have the expertise. They've got brilliant cryptographers. And after Stalingrad, they've got a hell of a lot of material, both key sheets and Enigma machines, and they've captured whole wireless units. And then in 1943, their intelligence becomes very good. Makes you wonder. Anyway, but as you say, a subject for another day. And this is Hinsley's verdict in his official history, where he basically says, the Allies made an all but totally accurate assessment of the German order of battle. They had figured it all out, and that gives them a tremendous advantage.
And it does make you wonder how the books were written. The early books, the Chester Wilmot kind of books written in the late 40s, 50s. When they presented the Battle of Normandy and the ensuing campaign, that they kind of just had to kind of work around this fact that there was this intelligence picture the Allies had built, and just put it all down to fighting very well, I suppose. But it is amazing now that we realize what a complete picture the Allies had, because it was undoubtedly an important asset.
Oh, it's a vital asset, and it gives that confidence. I mean, the thing that I try to stress in the book, and you get the danger with D-Day or Overlord is because it was a success. There's a danger that people assume it was always bound to succeed.
Yeah, foregone conclusion. Yeah,
it was a foregone conclusion, and it absolutely wasn't. I mean, Eisenhower writes his failure message communique in advance, as we know, and so it's by no means a foregone conclusion. And so we did an exhibition about D-Day. We don't say that Bletchley Park Intelligence won D-Day. It didn't. Blokes on the beach won D-Day. But every edge that you can get over your enemy is important. The intelligence is one of the legs of the table. And if you snap
essentially,
that leg
the
off,
codebreakers work and the Ultra was a force multiplier. It meant that the contribution of the men on the beach, that they had that extra protection behind them of knowledge, and I always kind of think that if you can survive that first wave, when you come to the beaches on D-Day, if you can get across that first hour, after then it almost becomes a foregone conclusion. But that first hour, it is absolutely in the balance, and of course we now know how it unfolded, but once the sun goes down on June the 6th, I think the success is kind of.
I mean, once you can get the metaphorical pipelines of men and equipment established across the wet bit, then it becomes much more of a certainty. But up until that point, but anyway, let's talk about the Germans for a minute. Yeah, is the other thing that's fish traffic in particular is really important for is strategic intention. It's not only telling you where the Germans are, what their order of battle is, but there's a lot of information coming in about what they're thinking, what they're expecting, and how they plan to deal with it. And so their strategic intention becomes very, very clear. And one of the ways this happens is von Rundstedt writes monthly appreciations back to Berlin, where he talks about what he thinks is going to happen and how he thinks he's going to be able to deal with it. And he does a lot of complaining as well, obviously, saying he hasn't got enough stuff. But those are sent via the Jellyfish link, and Bletchley Park is able to read them. And he also shares them with Kesselring in Italy, and he sort of has conversations with Kesselring about what should be done in the event of an invasion. And so the next slide, you can see there's actually a quote from one of these. One of his appreciations, where he's saying he's pretty sure that the Allies are ready now, and it could come any day, because there's a period through 43 where they're going, we're going to get invaded, but it's probably not going to be next week because the Allies haven't got everything they need. But then there's a turning point in January 44 where von Rundstedt pretty much goes, yeah, they're going to come any day now because they're clearly got themselves sorted out.
And to me, just to interrupt again, the ability to make predictions is, to me, what science is all about. Is it, if you take, for example, the theory of evolution, it's understanding the past is one thing, but now with their understanding of evolution, people can make predictions about what's going to happen next, or estimate. They can say, we expect to find this next. And the same thing applies to this with the Ultra, is that knowing where the Germans are and what they have is the first part, but being able to second guess their movements is incredible.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting about this is, I mean, people who read about Normandy will know that there's a strategic argument going on because Rommel's saying, to put it simply, you need the tanks on the beach, and von Rundstedt and Hitler are saying, no, you need to hold them back in this counterattack force in central France. And the solution they eventually come up with is kind of neither fish nor fowl. Some divisions are thrown forward, but some aren't. But while that strategic conversation is going on between the various German commanders, the discussion is being followed by the Allies. And in some ways, you could argue that it's fortunate that Rommel lost the argument in some ways.
Yeah.
But
My analogy, David, should you care to hear it, is that essentially what the Germans are doing in their preparation, knowing the invasion's coming, is they've got two options: defend on the beaches or defend from inland and counterattack. And they're going into the casino and they're putting half their money on red and half their money on black. And so in the end, they're just splitting their vote. They need to decide on one course of action, and then everybody sing to that exact same hymn sheet. But the problem is they're split, and I think that's fundamentally where it goes right for the Allies and badly for the Germans. They just don't stick their guns and go obsessively for one of the options.
Exactly, yes. And the other, in terms of intention, and this will lead us on slightly to this whole sort of deception question. This is a wonderful message that's in the National Archives. Ambassador Oshima, as I was saying, he, on the 30th of May, so days before the invasion is due, he goes to Berchtesgaden and he has tea with the Führer, and they have a chat about Hitler's expectations of the invasion. And Hitler actually tells him over tea, he goes, yes, they're probably going to invade Normandy, but that will be a feint, and their main attack is going to come in Calais. And the fact that, there's nothing Eisenhower can really do about it on the 30th of May because the plans are set, but it's a tremendous reassurance to him to learn that Hitler still thinks his operation is going to be a feint to a large invasion in Calais. Yeah. And that kind of brings us on to, I always wince slightly when I talk about deception because people get very, very excited about Bodyguard and Operation Fortitude and all the rest of it. The role that Bletchley played in it is not as big as some people claim. And the interesting thing about, we're talking about the Allied invasion being in Calais, the important thing about good deception operations is you reinforce preconceptions that your enemy already has.
Exactly.
You don't try and change his mind, you try and keep his mind where it is. And actually, because the Germans always intended to invade Kent from Calais, the idea that we'll invade Calais from Kent seems perfectly strategically obvious to them. So I'm not convinced that the deception operation is as powerful as some people make out. But the point about this map that I'm showing here is this is the German order of battle map. This is the equivalent map that Fremde Heere Vesta have produced for the Wehrmacht about the Allied forces. And you can see all of Patton's Fusag there in Kent and all the dummy forces. This does two things. One, it shows you the contrast in intelligence success.
Yeah. The
British have a very good map of what the Germans have got. The Germans have a very bad map of what the Allies have got. But more importantly, it's exaggerated the capability of the Allies. At that point, Fremde Heere West is estimating that the Allies have something like 80 divisions in the UK that they can use. The real number is about 30. So it's less than half of what their estimate is. They also estimate that we have a landing craft lift that can move 20 divisions in one lift, which they can't at all. I mean, the 5 divisions that land on Normandy are as many as can be lifted in one go. And what that means is the Germans have to plan for many, many more eventualities than are actually possible. The idea that we could mount a second invasion after the Normandy one, it was simply impossible. The resources didn't exist. But so long as the Germans believed that those resources did exist, they had to prepare for...
And it brings up the idea, in a sense, that it's better to have no intelligence picture at all than have an incorrect one. And the Germans, in the end, all they've done is created an incorrect vision of what the Allies have in Britain. So it's doing them more harm than good.
Exactly. And if they, because von Röhner and the team at Fremde Heere West are quite bad at counting divisions, they end up counting the same ones more than once and over-egging the number of forces available. And it kind of suits everybody in France to say that the Allied army is very, very big because the other option is they get transferred to Russia. So the other thing involved, the other thing that, where we're talking about the deception operation in particular, the one place Bletchley are involved quite heavily is reading Abwehr traffic, the German intelligence service, because all of these, the double-cross agents and everybody else are basically feeding the Germans via the Abwehr, particularly in Spain. And reading Abwehr traffic because allows you to see what messages are sinking in and what aren't. So you can refine your double cross message by seeing what they're swallowing and what they aren't, and that becomes quite important. But again, I think it's in some sources over-egg this, and they go on about how amazing the double cross operation was in persuading the Germans of all these different things. If you look at the Abwehr by 1944 is falling apart. It's not, doesn't have much credence with the German authorities. It's eventually taken over by the SD in 1944, and Canaris finds himself in prison. So it's not a great intelligence organization to start with. And unlike what's happening at Bletchley, it has no sort of discernment. Any fact is good for the Abwehr. Any fact they can get, they will send to their bosses to make themselves look busy. The point about what Bletchley is doing is they're collecting a tremendous amount of information, but a lot of it is chaff. Yeah. And if you send all of it to Eisenhower, he's going to drown. So what you need to do is need to have people thinning it out and making sense of it and presenting him with the useful stuff. German intelligence in general, and the Abwehr in particular, do the exact opposite. They just bombard OKW in Berlin with everything they've learned. And some of it is splendidly ridiculous. There is a message which is sent on the 1st of April from the Abwehr saying they have good intelligence that the Brazilians are about to invade Portugal, which I think is a pretty interesting intelligence conclusion to reach at that point.
And David O'Keefe is making the point that for years the agents were kind of used as a cover for the success of the more boring. I'm not using the word correctly, boring, but the SIG process. Because agents is sexy, aren't agents? You can kind of make books about it and movies, and it sounds all very exciting. But actually, it's the work, as you said, of lots of people just essentially with 6x4 index cards that's perhaps making the difference, rather than the glamorous side of the agent.
Yes, I mean they are about to release yet another film about Operation Mincemeat.
Yeah,
and the film, I'm sure it'll be a very entertaining film. But the question people don't ask about that is, did it make any difference? And I think the academic community is quite divided. I mean, it's a fascinating story, but and what attracts people to intelligence history. What as I say this slightly ruefully, if I could find a really entertaining intelligence story full of colourful characters doing wacky things, even if they made no difference to the war effort at all, I could probably sell the book, because that's what people like reading. But
yeah, no, I'm with you on the Mincemeat. It made maybe a bit of a difference, but maybe overplayed a little bit. But I'll go and see the movie because it looks to be quite good.
Well, we all like a World War II movie. We've got to support them, otherwise people won't make them.
So there's a bit about the Abwehr traffic there.
Yeah. So that's just to sort of, I'm conscious of time here, to move on a little bit. What happens after the invasion? And you can argue, I think reasonably fairly, that Bletchley's big contribution to Normandy, to DDay, to Overlord, happens before the first boots hit the beach.
Yeah,
it's this preparatory work, this provision of information for the planning and the organisation of the operation, which is where they really excel. By the time troops have landed, the intelligence cycle is for Enigma and for Lorenz and things is a little bit too slow to deal with the tactical battle. And so Ultra is still being supplied to commanders, and it's still quite important, but it doesn't have this critical significance that it does in the planning phase. The slide you've got here, interestingly, is one of the things we have in the collection is actually during one of the key things they do on D-Day itself is monitor the German Navy in the Channel. Because the one thing that really the British and the Allies are really fearful of is if the German Navy can intercept the fleets crossing the Channel, that's when it's at its most vulnerable. So Bletchley set up a specific operation, and it's the only time they intercept messages directly at Bletchley Park itself. They have wireless sets at Bletchley, listening to the German Commander Kanal Kuster and the other German Navy units in the Channel. And what's happening there? And they're waiting to see the German Navy spot the invasion. And we're very fortunate to have the original handwritten messages for this. And you can follow the German Navy's reaction to the invasion from sort of midnight onwards. And it's clear that the German Navy doesn't figure out what's going on until till basically dawn breaks and they see a lot of blobs off the coast, and they all go, "Oh my God, what's that?"
And it's worth just emphasizing the point there that by this point, not only are the Germans not really aware of what's going on, we, the Allies, are almost in real time being aware that they are not aware of what's going on. I mean, that again is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at that image, the TOO in the middle of the top is the origin time of the German message. And then down in the bottom left-hand corner is the time that message was sent to Admiral Ramsay, who's at Naval Expeditionary Force Headquarters in Portsmouth. And it's less than 3 hours.
Yeah.
So it's not quite real time, but it's pretty quick. And so they are able to follow the German Navy's reaction. And later on, the Germans send out a task force of sort of torpedo boats, German torpedo boats, bigger than British torpedo boats, but send a force out from Le Havre to intercept the DDay, the invasion beaches. And signals are being sent to Ramsay about that incident almost exactly as it's taking place. They don't do very well. There's a smoke screen protecting the flank of the invasion fleet. They sail through it and they're confronted by HMS Warspite, and a few 15-inch rounds discourage them and they go back to harbour again. But at that point, studying the Navy is really important, and it does give a vital intelligence advantage at that point. After that, for the remainder of Normandy, the role of Ultra, I would say, diminishes a bit. I mean, if you're identifying where German divisions are in France, which is what they do best, by the time those German divisions are actually fighting you, you know where they are.
Yeah.
You know, you can look over the hedge.
And this is where you'd like, it would be ideal if we were getting stuff at the regimental or company level, because that's how the Battle of Normandy was essentially engaged. Some of just independent battalions making their movements. And of course, we're getting stuff more at a divisional level. And by the time we're getting it and making sense of it, the division has probably already moved on the ground anyway. So it makes sense that the best period was the pre-day period. But there's still some stuff coming through. And this brings us, I guess, nightly to the next, which is Operation Lüttich, the German advance towards Avranches. So this is where Ultra comes into its own again. So explain a little bit more.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that Ultra can still do, and it does quite effectively, is where German units are not in the line and where they're moving around sort of in the interior of France. One of the things that Ultra picks up very well, for example, is 2nd SS Panzer coming up when Das Reich is moving up from the south of France. They're able to follow it day by day, and when it finally arrives in Normandy, they're able to tell Montgomery, or actually arrives in the American sector, they're able to tell the Americans the day before it gets there, it's finally got here. And similarly, the units that ultimately come down from the Pas de Calais, they can follow them as they sort of make their way towards the battlefield, and they give that prior warning for their arrival. And the point about sort of Mortain and all of that is that the Germans are pulling divisional armoured units out of the line and moving them west, and those movements are detectable in Ultra. And at that period, interestingly, there's a sort of virtuous circle, because the Germans will plan an operation, there will be Enigma traffic about it, and it can take 12 to 24 hours for that information to reach the field commanders via Bletchley. But quite often, the attacks, because there's so much tactical air power being used by the Allies, the Germans have to postpone their attacks. So they say tonight they plan an attack for tomorrow morning, but they don't actually launch it tomorrow morning. They launch it the day after tomorrow, because they have so much difficulty getting their assets in place because of the air power. And in that intervening day, Bletchley's read the messages and been able to give the warning. And this is kind of what happens in Mortain, is the German counterattack is delayed. There's a certain amount of build-up that Bletchley is able to identify, and then the attack itself is delayed for long enough that the intelligence can be gathered, and Bomber Command take care of it before it even really starts, in that sense. So it's one of the few occasions where the operational tempo is slow enough for Ultra to intervene. But it's slightly unusual in that sense.
And just to recap on Mortain there, I mean, it didn't necessarily affect the defenders on the hill there, the 30th Division, but at a higher level in terms of bringing in the Typhoons and the P-47s and the Mustangs and moving the artillery groups around, it made a fundamental difference. So, and folks, we have, of course, done shows on the Mortain offensive. Go back through World War II TV and you'll find the shows we did last August. So that you can go and look at them at your heart's content. But let's talk about, by this point, I love this phrase you come up with, information dominance. It's a great 2 words there.
It's not mine. The historian at GCHQ used it, and I robbed it from him. But it sums up what this is about. It's the idea that the Allies know almost everything they want to know. The Germans know very little of what they want to know, and what they think they do know is mostly wrong. And that's no way to fight a battle. You know, even if the sides had been equal, which they weren't, that information imbalance is really, really important. And that's what good intelligence does for you. It gives you that information imbalance that allows you to win, or to win more cheaply. These last couple of slides are this is MI14. They wrote an appreciation at the end of the war about where they'd got their information from, and these 2 quotes just reference the fact that they relied very, very heavily on Bletchley products, on Ultra, to tell them what was going on. To move on to the next one, I'm sorry, this is all very small on my screen. Let me just flip over here. Can't read my own slides.
I can read if you want.
I found it. Here we go. Yes, this is in the history of Part 3, and it's making that point that I was just making, that it's not about tactical intelligence. It's not about what tank's on the other side of the hedge. It's actually about this long-term development process, this idea of acquiring very, very detailed information over a long period of time. And that contrasts with what I said at the very outset, is a lot of people think Bletchley is a news agency, that it tells you what the Germans did yesterday, you know, what they said in their messages yesterday. They do that, but that's not really why they're important. Why they're important is because they're able to build this long-term picture. And that's what turns them from a code-breaking organization into a genuine intelligence agency.
Essentially, it's what we're saying. It's kind of predicting the future rather than reporting the past, isn't it? I mean, predicting is maybe a strong word, but able to interpret what's going on, to make a kind of a statement about the likelihood of what's going to be happening next. And
exactly.
that kind of information to commanders in the field is priceless.
Absolutely.
And you know, this is Eisenhower himself, and Eisenhower again. It was just ecstatic in his praise of the information that was coming his way, and again, we'll talk about in a minute. It's sad that so much of this then got forgotten for the next 3 decades, but that was just the way it was. These people at the time knew how important it was, but the general public, of course, and most of the troops on the ground had no idea that they had this advantage that was running in sort of secrecy behind them.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is, you know, even down at company level, commanders are getting the bigot maps, which have every German machine gun position and minefield marked on them. And they must have thought it was amazing, but they're not told how that's been derived. You know, they're just given the information and they're grateful for it. I mean, that 3rd paragraph, we get a lot of mileage out of this letter because it's kind of our tagline for the exhibition. But as he says, it's been of priceless value to me. It saved thousands of British and American lives, in no small way contributed to the speed with which the enemy was routed. It's Eisenhower himself is saying, I absolutely relied on this stuff. You know, I couldn't have done it without it.
And he's saying it's essentially the people that matter, because there's that famous statement that Eisenhower said it's a statement, it's a letter he wrote to someone saying, I think it was something like the role of the French resistance in France was worth that of 4 divisions or something. And as great as that thing was, it wasn't really meant for the publicness, and it wasn't necessarily what he really thought. It was something he was saying, but this is what he actually believed. He's thanking the people who are involved in it. So
I mean, this is a letter directly to Stuart Minges, who's head of SIS, who is basically the boss of Bletchley Park, ultimately, saying your chaps did really well. And the next rung down on the ladder is letters from people like Minges and Travis, who was the head of Bletchley Park, he produces letters to the staff saying, "You've all done a brilliant job. Remember, you can't tell anyone about it, but take it from me, you've done a brilliant job." And then in 1945, they all go home and keep stum.
And that is so what's remarkable about this is that how many of these workers on this, because we're in the stage now where anybody who was involved in World War II who's still with us, they're still with us because they were 18, 19 or 20 at the end of the war. But a lot of people involved in Bletchley were considerably older than that. So they have not just died in recent years. They may have died 20, 30 years ago. So how many of these people, I mean, Turing himself essentially died before the story could be broken. And you wonder what kind of books would have come out by some of the senior people involved if they had only been alive when it happened, because it's people like yourself have interpreted and written about the actions of these people and some of the individuals. I mean, we have the books on the Bletchley girls and people like that, and they're great to give an idea of people operating. Not, I don't mean at a lower level disrespectfully, but that kind of.
They tend to be the worm's eye view. Yeah, they tend to be from the junior people. What's really useful for me is the GCHQ, as it was in 1945. They were very keen that they shouldn't forget what they'd done, and that they should take the lessons from their success in the Second World War. And so there was a very large-scale knowledge capture exercise, and all of the different sections were tasked with writing their own histories in 1945. And so you have the history of Hut 6, the history of Hut 3, the history of 6, the history of Naval Section. And all of these classified reports, and they run to hundreds of pages, were produced. And they're very, very detailed. A lot of those documents, I mean, they weren't available, for example, to Bennett when he wrote his book in the 70s. Those have only been declassified in the early 2000s, 2003, 2004. Some of those Hut histories came out. And it's not until those documents appeared that you could really get into the heart of the story. Even then, some of them, some of the authors, it varies. Some of them are very gossipy and very, they name names and they complain about stuff. Others are written in pure civil services and they never mention the name of an individual, and they're all very pucker. But in all cases, they contain absolutely fascinating information. Some of them are highly technical. They can be quite a dull read as well.
Yeah, I bet. But this, we'll bring things to an end fairly shortly, and we've kind of addressed some of the things, questions, things as we gone along. And thank you, David O'Keefe and Trent Telenko, particularly for basically answering the questions as we're going along, because there's a lot of interest today, which I'm very grateful for, and it's been pretty good that the questions have been asked as we've gone along. But we talked at the beginning of the show about the fact that in some ways we're still at the infancy of understanding, and we mentioned that the idea that maybe the Soviets are breaking the Enigma codes, maybe they weren't. So there is obviously work to be done in the future. But for the benefit of those watching who are perhaps thinking about traveling again when we get out of this horrible COVID era, what's happening at Bletchley Park today, and what's going to be happening over the next kind of year or so there, because the site is building all the time. So what's the latest from where you work?
Well, thank you. Yes, we're doing pretty well at the moment. We've had as you can imagine, we've had a pretty rough 12 months. Well, not 12 months, 18 months. We were forced to shut last year, but we're more or less back to normal now, and we are open every day except Christmas. So come on down. We did one of our most recent products was the research I did for DDay was to support an exhibition which we've created, which opened in 2019. Just before we shut. So we have it's basically a very large scale film that takes you through a lot of the material I've been talking about tonight. So we have a thing about DDay, which opened in 2019. I'm currently in the process of, as we were discussing earlier, there's a new exhibition which will open next April, which is all about the later part of the war and about naval section in particular. So defensive convoys and some of that naval story. We opened an exhibition earlier this year, going back to the beginning of the story, which is called Early Days, which talks about the site in the mansion when it first got started, when there were only sort of 150 people. So we have a whole, we're constantly opening new stuff, which is good because it keeps me in a job. But and the site is growing in terms of the amount of buildings we have accessible. the other thing you can do if you can't come on down is we have a podcast. I've been for the last 4 or 5 years. I've been working on a monthly podcast, and that we have a series within that called "It Happened Here," which is basically using anniversaries as an excuse and working through the war, looking at the particular intelligence aspects of all sorts of different aspects of the war. I've been there long enough now that we've kind of been round once and we're going round again. But for example, my assistant Tom has just recorded one on Battle of Britain and the early days of Ultra and its intelligence impact on the Battle of Britain. I will be looking at Pearl Harbor in December, of course, as that anniversary ticks around. So we've got stuff online as well as coming to the site, but I would very much encourage people to come to the site.
Absolutely. It raises that problem or the issue as well, of course, of communicating something that is quite technical. There is a lot of math involved. There's a lot of technology involved. But I suppose in some ways, if you start at the end product, so the results of code breaking, so this affected the landings in Normandy, or this helped with this, and then work back to where the information was derived. It's maybe a cleverer way of looking at it than trying to start from the maths, because starting from the maths
absolutely
lose a hell of a lot of people immediately.
I think the important thing about this story and what talking to you tonight has been able to do is to say, why should we care about this stuff? Because and I think this will come out through your talks for the whole week, that cryptanalysis, code systems, it's not an end in itself. It's not a crossword that people do for their own amusement. It has intelligence impact on real life, on real wars, and it's translating the maths into the life and death stories, the victories and defeats that makes the story really, really powerful and interesting. And the other thing that I think we try and do in some of our exhibitions, we did an exhibition about the bomb machines where it's a very, very technical story, and that technical information is in there if you want it. But equally, a lot of our visitors will just come in and their reaction is, my God, that's complicated. And there's a sense of wonder at the fact that people can do this, that there are brains out there that create these machines and come up with these methods to do these extraordinarily clever things. And even if you don't understand the detail, you can grasp the size of the problem and be impressed by the fact that anyone solved it at all, And so that's an aspect of the story, I think, that. And also, we try and tell the human story as well. You've alluded to some of the books about sort of the veterans. There is an interest in just what life was like, what it was like to be involved in this process, and also just what life was like during the war at all, in all these different aspects. And so, we have events. We have 40s events in the summer where people come, and some people will come and, have a 40s hairdo, and just immersing themselves in the life of the wartime period is a bigger pull for our visitors.
Well, I think we've successfully plugged Bletchley Park. We've plugged your work there. We've talked about your book. We've talked about the role of Ultra. We've talked about the role of Bletchley Park. So as far as I'm concerned, job done. We can put the ciphers away, close the code books, close the filing cabinets, and leave it at that. So I'll just remind people what we've got coming up tomorrow. Then I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a second. So, folks, with more coming the week goes on. We've got Matt Zulo coming on tomorrow talking about the On the Roof Gang. This is the American team of Codebreakers. He's written 2 books about that. That'll be really fantastic. Andy Boyd on Thursday looking at the work in the Far East. Then, of course, David O'Keefe is joining us again on Friday later time. That'll be 2 hours later normal to kind of answer all your questions about Ultra and just chew the cud really after a week of brilliant shows. So as usual, folks, I urge you to follow what we're doing on Twitter and social media. Consider becoming a patron. The links are in the description below to buying David Kenyon's book. The links to Bletchley Park as an organization and museum are all in the description below. But right now, it remains for me to say thank you very much, Dr. David Kenyon, for joining us. And we overran a little bit from what I intended, but it was only because it was good. And did you enjoy it, David?
Very much so. Yes. Thank you for having me along. It's been great.
Well, you're welcome to come back anytime, and we may do maybe an entire week about Bletchley Park at some point, or we'll come back and do it. I don't know, but I will come back and talk to you. But right now, it remains me to say thank everybody for watching. This is Paul Woodard for World War II TV. I will see you all again tomorrow for part 3 of Codes and Codebreakers Week. Thank you all. Have a good day.